Hello, everybody. My name is Jørgen Brun. I'm a professor in comparative literature at Linnaeus University in Sweden. And I'm part of a research center called Linnaeus University Center for Intermediate and Multimodal Studies. First, I want to thank Asun Lopez Varela for inviting me to give this lecture. I think it's, as I will say many times, I think in this lecture, I think it's very important that from the humanities we try to engage with societal challenges from our particular viewpoint, and by working seriously with the things that really matter. And of course, the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, is one of these questions that relates also to the UN social development goals and other visions for a future for both Europe and the world. So I'm going to give a talk with a slightly strange title, perhaps: Revolution Makes the Sunshine, Intermediate Studies, Eco-Criticism and Truthfulness Across Media. And I'll begin with just saying what I'm going to do. I'm going to give a background for this. I'm going to explain this strange phrase of revolution makes the sunshine. Then I'm going to introduce to intermediate studies and introduce to eco-criticism, and then I'll discuss 4 examples of truthfulness in eco-media. That's it. So let's jump right into it. With a quote. Pollution is in fashion today, exactly in the same way as revolution. It dominates the whole life of society, and it is represented in illusory form in the spectacle. It is the subject of mind-numbing chatter in a plethora of erroneous and mystifying writing and speech, yet it really does have everyone by the throat. It is on display everywhere as ideology, yet it is continually gaining ground as a material development. 2 antagonistic tendencies: progression towards the highest form of commodity production and the project of its total negation, equally rich in contradictions within themselves, grow ever stronger in parallel with the other. So this is a difficult quote to begin with, but I'm kind of fond of it because I think it's into it is packed many insights that are really important. First of all, this feeling that everybody's talking about pollution or the environment today, and also the feeling that there's so much to talk about that perhaps we're kind of failing a little bit to really get a grasp of it. That's the main part of the first part of the quote here. Also, it says very clearly, this quote, that that it's part of a tendency with 2 antagonistic tendencies. The highest form of commodity production, that is our capitalistic way of producing things and services, which is rising and being more and more sophisticated, you could say, but also the project of its own total negation, because that's of course what the ecological crisis is also about, that we are kind of producing ourselves into some kind of catastrophic situation. And what I like about this quote is also that it's not a new quote. It could have been written today, I suppose, by some left-leaning activist, or by Greta Thunberg for that matter. But it is actually from a lecture, a text written by Guy Debord in 1971, and only translated much later. And the end of this quote goes like this. Guy Debord says, "When it rains, when there are clouds of smog over Paris, let us never forget that it is the government's fault. Alienated industrial production makes the rain. Revolution makes the sunshine." So he's partly ironic here, partly very, very specific. during the 1968 uprisings in Paris, much of the industry was was paused, and smog apparently was disappearing, and sunshine was coming down. So revolution does create sunshine, and the quote has something to do with what I will call in just a moment the nature of our ecological crisis in the Anthropocene, namely that it is man-made and also that it is media-born. But first, a little bit of statistics, just to frame the seriousness of what we're talking about here. I'm referring here a BBC report from published September 14, 2021, where it says that nearly 60% of young people approached said they felt very worried or extremely worried about climate. More than 45% of those questions said feelings about the climate affected their daily lives. 3/4 of them said that they thought the future was frightening. Over half say they think humanity is doomed, and 2/3 reporting feeling sad, afraid, and anxious. And many felt fear, anger, despair, grief, and shame, and then also as well as hope. So you listening to this, I suppose most of you are young people, perhaps recognize this, either you feel it yourself or you have friends feeling like this. I can say that from my own kind of family and so on, I recognize parts of these feelings. But also as a kind of, grown-up, mature man, I think this is something I and we as grown-ups have to take into consideration. There's a real worry out there and we need to do something about it. So what I'm going to say several times in my lecture today is that the situation we're in is man-made and media-born. The ecological crisis is produced by human beings, and we get to know about it by way of media. So first, the man-made part. This has to do with the idea of an Anthropocene insight. So people are talking about geologists and climate scientists and so on, saying that we have entered a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene, the human epoch, you could say. And normally geological epochs are, thousands or millions even of years, extreme time spans, but actually it has turned out that the Anthropocene is something that human beings have created by way of their different systems. So it's not all human beings, it's some human beings in some parts of the world have created most of what we're facing now as, for instance, the climate change. But the problems of the Anthropocene, the things that define the planetary situation at the moment is, and I mentioned some of the factors here, that it's a fossil economy, it's destructive extraction projects. It's a dramatic decrease of biodiversity in the oceans and on land. It's the changed phosphor and nitrate circles as a result of agriculture. It's the depletion of natural resources, and then, sorry, wrong slide. And also, of course, it's the question of climate change, which I mentioned. So all this are created by man. The other part of this is that this is something we learn by way of media. In our research group at Linnaeus University that I'm part of, we say that it is a man-made ecological crisis and it is media-born. And here we have to understand something that the Guy Debord quote that I began with saw very, very clearly, namely that media are both windows through which we can learn about something, but media can also be kind of veils or curtains, something that hinders us from see something. And so it's when we are talking about the Anthropocene crisis situation, we should be aware that it is man-made, human-made, and media-born. That is the shortest possible, perhaps, definition. And one way of talking about this is perhaps the simplest way is to remind ourselves that the way we talk about climate change has to do with the words we choose also. And as you may know, there are many, many different words of the same. I'm just throwing in a few here. Is it a climate breakdown, a climate resilience? Is it climate variability, etc., etc.? The words matter. The way we talk about the things, the way we mediate things matter. That's what this talk is all about. So at Linnaeus University, a university center for intermediate and multimodal studies, which is the research group I'm part of, we started the capitalism crisis as man-made and media-born. And this is a quote I borrowed from an old colleague of mine, Isak Winkelholm from Copenhagen. And then also we analyze and compare representations of the mediated ecological crisis, including lots of different media types. And I'm mentioning a few here. Scientific reports, popular science, web communication, manifests, graphic novels, documentaries. You can just continue the list. And that's actually what is special about our approach to the environmental humanities position, namely that we try to compare from many, many different media types from intermediate theory. So first, some ideas about intermediate studies. So we think that media are the condition for the thinking and communication of human beings. This is pretty basic, but pretty important also. And therefore, we could also say that we human beings live in media environments. We live surrounded by different media, by computers, by phones, by books. I'm using language to communicate with you. That's a media type also. We are living in media environments, the media environments that define us in many ways. And that has led some theoreticians to talk about the mediatized societies. For instance, Stiarbart in Copenhagen talks about the mediatized societies. That means that, for instance, in highly developed societies, questions like religion, love, school, education, politics are all dominated by elements of mediation. We think politics in terms of how things are being communicated in digital media, social media, and on television, and not only on the kind of subject matter itself. When thinking about religion now, we have to take into consideration that people have many ways of meeting each other, reading and understanding religious ideas. So even religion is being mediatized, etc., etc. And then the specific intermediate idea that we often quote W.J.T. Mitchell when he said some years ago now that all media are mixed media. All media are mixed media. Given the fact that all media are mixed, then we take as a starting point the heteromedial perspective and the media transformation perspective. First, the heteromedial perspective is a synchronic combination in one media product. And I can just take up this book cover where you will see text, drawn image, colors, layout that together in combination communicate some kind of message, some kind of thing that wants to be communicated here. And the main analytical question that we're after when we look at things from the heteromedial, the combination perspective is, what effects does the mixing or the combination of media and modality aspects have? What kind of messages can be conveyed mixing this and this and this? So for instance, on a book cover, you can't really have, a full scientific report describing the history of climate change. That would be impossible to fit in on a book cover. A book cover is an economically ordered space where you want to know the title of the book, you want to know the author's names, you want to have something that catches your eye. So that's a kind of media affordances of a book cover, which gives possibilities and limitations. And that's a combination perspective. The other perspective is the media transformation perspective of form and content between several media. This has to do with the idea that form and content can travel from one medium to another. The most obvious example, perhaps, is novels that are turned into film in film adaptations. So first we have a novel, then parts of the novel is turned into a film, a new feature film. But actually media transformations takes place all the time, from comic figures to entertainment parks. Think about the Disney World, of course. From political discussion to badges on your coat, from scientific results and to pedagogical discussions. Media form and content from one media type to another takes place all the time, you could say. And here what we are interested in is what form and what content can be transferred across media borders. What are the affordances of the different media? Affordance here means possibilities and limitations. So any media product, let's say we call this book cover a media product. Any media product can be can be interrogated either as a combination or as a media transformation. I said that from a combination perspective, you analyze the words, images, layout, colors in order to understand what does it communicate and what can it communicate in this particular way. But actually, of course, this book cover is just one in a long line of book covers. There's been book covers for centuries. So it's actually also one version here where form and content of all earlier book covers are being transformed into this particular version of a creative book cover. So our starting point is that all representations of the ecological crisis in the Anthropocene, they can be seen as media combinations and media transformations. And that is what I'm going to demonstrate later on in my presentation. Let me just take a short example here. This is a famous example called "The Anthropocene is functionally and stratigraphically distinct from the Holocene." That's a scientific article, rather conventional scientific article, which we can take a look at from an intermediate perspective. You see here, of course, in a more or less random page here I've cut in. You see that there's text, there's a photograph, there's arrows put into the photograph around here. You see writing in the photograph. So it's a deeply mixed media product that tries to communicate complex scientific matrices in a way that is relatively easy to understand for a scientist. Here we have another example from the article where colors, graphs, lines going up and down symbolizes parts of a really heavy data set that we should grasp quickly when we look at an article like this. And I have one more example of this where color, text, and graphs are used in a way to demonstrate some scientific truth in a way that is easy to understand and to immediately see, so to speak. So this is just an example that of also the fact that from the point where a scientist is going out into nature, into the Greenland ice, for instance, to see color changes or temperature changes, from that initial observation, which is turned into a data point, from that to be kind of a fact, to be something like in an archive that has to be produced and written about, it has to be peer reviewed in a scientific community, and then finally comes out so that I can read it on my computer screen. Several media transformations have taken place, as with all other communication in our world. Now a few basic terms on eco-criticism. An early definition was by Gotfelty in 1996, where she said that eco-criticism is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. That's a very broad definition, of course. And often we divide eco-criticism, which came from literary studies, but which is now a phenomenon also. It's a critical trend in musicology, in art history, in film studies, and in lots of the aesthetic fields, so to speak. We often divide into different waves or traditions. And even though it was anti-theory from the outset, more and more it is under the influence of contemporary theory and political ideas, including then feminism, very importantly, and also Marxism, post-structuralism, and in recent years, new materialism. Ursula Heise, one of the leading names in eco-criticism, has defined eco-criticism by way of some questions here. In what ways do highly evolved and self-aware beings relate to nature? What roles do language, literature, and art play in this relation? How have modernization and globalization processes transformed it? Is it possible to return to more ecologically attuned ways of inhabiting nature? And what would be the cultural prerequisites for such a change? Eco-criticism has a triple allegiance to the scientific study of nature. Sorry, I'm just rambling on here. So that's some of the questions here we have to do with in eco-criticism. In the second part here, in this part of the quote, Ursula Heise says that there's a kind of triple, three dimensions to eco-criticism very often. She says that eco-criticism has a triple allegiance to the scientific study of nature, the scholarly analysis of cultural representations, and the political struggle for sustainable ways of inhabiting the world. We could say that eco-criticism has it walks on three legs. It has to do with science, natural science, something out there. It has to do with the cultural studies, and has to do with some kind of activism or political struggle. That's the three legs of eco-criticism. And one of the broader, more modern definitions, I forgot to put a name on this. This is Greg Garrard, writing this definition, I think in 2015 perhaps, where he defines broadly eco-criticism as, I quote, the study of the relationship between the human and the non-human throughout human history and entailing critical analysis of the term human itself. That's a broad term. I think it's a very useful term because it questions really the basics of our understanding of the world and culture in this world. So the position we try to fill in our research group in Växjö, that's what we call intermediate eco-criticism. It contributes to eco-criticism by stating that all ecological questions per definition relate to questions of mediation and representation. So there's no direct way to go to the world out there or to the climate crisis. It always has to go by way of mediation and representation. And mediation and representation, that's something we are very good at understanding and discussing and analyzing in intermediate studies. And then also as a consequence of that, intermediate eco-criticism, and that's basic for eco-criticism actually, and for environmental humanities also. We also demonstrate that the ecological crisis is not only a natural, scientific, or a technological question, it's a problem relating to key questions of the humanities. So we should not forget that the ecological crisis, people who favor technology or people who are perhaps inside the natural sciences, they tend to think that it's a kind of quick fix perhaps, or a slower fix, but some kind of fix of this that can get us out of this. Whereas we should be aware from the humanities that this is a question of culture that has led us here. These crises has a history. There are psychological components to it. There are existential threats that meet us that we from the humanities are better at confronting than the natural science or techno studies. So in intermediate eco-criticism, the way we conduct this in our research group in Växjö, we can do analyses and interpretations of isolated specific media products, one singular book, one film, one web page, or we can make comparisons between media products across different media borders. So very often we are interested in seeing how does a popular website, how can that be compared to a novel? What can be communicated in a novel as opposed to a popular website? What can be communicated in a pop song as compared to a scientific treatise of 500 pages? That kind of questions we're interested in comparing. And as I said, these comprises all sorts of media types. And we're interested in trying to find some topics that are common for different media types that we can compare. And one of these questions are narrativity. How are things narrated in a science report, in a novel, in a documentary? We're interested in the representation of human agency. What kind of images, what kind of understandings of human agency, what humans can do we get from a newspaper article as opposed to a eco-critical poem? Some of my colleagues have studied food cultures. How is food represented in the arts and in science, and what role does food have in a future where we have to live in other ways? And then the final question is the production of truth claims. So I am continuing here with trying to say a few words on truthfulness as an transmedial phenomenon. So truthfulness was one of the example of topics or motifs that we are interested in investigating across different media types. And let me just briefly say a few words about what is truthfulness. I want to say that I've drawn a chapter called Truthfulness and Truth Claims as Transmedial Phenomena, which I have co-written with my colleagues Niklas Salmose, Beate Schirmacher, and Emma Thornborg. And they're available in this open access publication that I edited with Schirmacher called Intermediate Studies, Meaning Making Across Media. Routledge came out just recently, this book. So I recommend this book. I do this because it is the result of years of work of trying to make intermediate studies comprehensible and useful for students and scholars, and we're very happy with the results. And also I dare to say this because it's an open access publication, so that you can free of charge log into Routledge, find this book and download it for free. In this book, one of the chapters is about truthfulness that we have discussed then with different examples, including news, including ecological crisis in different in media. And our idea is that truthfulness is something that is exists in all media types, and that's why we call it a transmedial phenomenon. So truthfulness is actually a kind of a goal of all communication, fictive or non-fictive, political or journalistic or artistic. There's always an attempt to create some kind of truthfulness, we argue, and the truthfulness is produced by way of what we call truth claims. Truth claims are kind of direct parts of the text which produces the effect of truthfulness. And that is what I want to demonstrate in 4 examples from now on. I want to begin with this graphic novel, Saison Brune from 2012, written and drawn and conceptualized by Philippe Squazzoni. I refer here to the English translation of the book called Climate Changed. You'll find this and most of the other titles that are mentioned in the end of this presentation in a reference list. Climate change, or Saison Brune, it is an example of a specific form of truthfulness. I have written truth claims here. It's a little unfortunate. I mean truthfulness, actually. What I mean is that this graphic novel produces truthfulness by way of autobiography. And I will demonstrate how in a few slides here. So this is a book about a man, Philippe Squazzoni himself, who finds out that he doesn't know very much about the ecological crisis and about politics concerning this. So he starts investigating, he starts researching this question. What is climate change? What is the science behind it? Who tries to hinder it? Who tries to promote it, etc. And he conducts interviews with experts, but instead of making, you know, a kind of a user's guide or a guide to a dummy's guide to climate change, where you are presented with facts, this is a book about a man who researches the facts and tries to write about this in a graphic novel. So that's also why this is the very first, when you open the book, this is what you see. And the in the French version here, you see a man considering how to begin a book which is, in a sense, on the end of the world. This is about catastrophes, about things changes dramatically, and how to make a book about this. And I think the answer to this question is that Philippe Squazzoni thinks that the best way to produce a truthful representation of science is to put himself into this also. So that's why it is an autobiographical production of truth. We see this is one of the typical slides here. It's a big book. It's a book of 450 pages, and there's lots of graphs and lots of numbers and lots of quotes from scientists and experts. But mostly Squazzoni, he chooses to put himself in between the facts and the world and the reader, so that he is the one who filters all the knowledge that is then drawn and written into the book. And one example is this one. It's one of the well-known hockey curves, which is drawn over him sitting at his desk, doing research, writing and drawing. And on top of that, we see then the graphs. And it's an example of how he tries to make truthfulness an autobiographical fact, so to speak. So it's not objective facts, clean from context, clean from existential or psychological questions. These are scientific facts that are presented in a framework of psychology and reflections and existential problems. We also see this framing of the scientific facts and the truthfulness in a spread like this, where we see the autobiographical depiction of himself considering some problems concerning both the research and how to confront this research, how to act upon this. This is very much a book about how to take in all the knowledge that he researches, and how to change your life in the light of that. And we see that as one of these kind of spreads where we see in a classical, almost a kind of cliche, of thinking person. But it is a part of the production of the autobiographical truthfulness, I would claim. And then we go to the other end of the book, the final spread here, where we again on a kind of reflexive in a reflexive tone is about how to finish the project that has begun. And there's a kind of a ethical question perhaps in this, that the couple here sits down to work. So there's a kind of way of confronting the climate crisis by way of producing things, by way of producing work, by acting in it. And once again, by doing an autobiographical version of the scientific facts. So that was the autobiographical graphic novel version of this. Now let's take another pole in the discussion, namely the scientific production, the pure scientific, you could say, production of truth claims in the IPCC Climate Change 2021, the physical basis report that came out the autumn of 2021. And I'm here taking a look at a few pages in the summary to policymakers. So some of you will know, of course, that the IPCC is the UN panel on the science assessments on climate change, planetary climate change. So this is thousands of renowned scientists from different fields, that they do not conduct research, so they do not produce scientific facts. What they do is they do assessments of the global state-of-the-art knowledge on the planetary climate change. So, and this is a very well-respected panel. This is the state-of-the-art of climate science that produces the best available overviews of what we know about this. The real report, so to speak, the scientific report, is about 3,000 pages. I did not read that. I have been looking a little bit in it, but I have been reading the summary to policymakers, which is, I think, 45 pages, which is meant to be more accessible for non-experts to get a grasp of what is going on. I strongly recommend that you take a look at this. This is freely available as open access on the internet. If you Google on summary to policymakers IPCC, you'll get it directly. It's very, very scary, but it's also a very clear way of providing us knowledge about the situation we're in. So if we begin with this page, it's an example of how objective truthfulness is trying to be accomplished by the writers and the designers of this report by way of visualization of scientific data. I do not have the time to go into details with this, but I can say that this is a kind of visualization with text below also that shows some of the temporal developments. And you see, once again, it's we're talking about, of course, an intermediate production of meaning here with diagrams, colors, notes, letters, and graphs, and so on. That is meant to communicate in a accessible, relatively simple way, time passing. In the next slide here, we have a view of the visualization of spatiality instead of space, and you may see this directly. It took a little while for me to understand that these three sections here are actually kind of world images of the entire world, symbolized in I guess 25 sections or something. And once again, in a way to quickly and in a clear way and in a relatively objective way also symbolizes different developments in the world, situations and concerning, I think, heat and water resources in the world. So whereas the first slide I showed was a symbolization, a visualization of time going on, this is a visualization trying to, in an economic way, demonstrate space. And in this on this page, then it's a visualization of possible futures. Again, using different kind of graphs, images, not images, but colors, color gradings, and trying to give an impression of how a future will like following different scenarios. So this is examples of thousands and thousands and thousands of man-hours of scientific work that is being compressed into 42 pages. For instance, one page here on the kind of possible futures relating to climate change. So that so we're talking about a media transformation. First, we had some kind of scientific facts, then it was archived, disseminated into articles, then it has been read, peer-reviewed, discussed in the IPCC, different sub-panels, and then finally it has this knowledge, so to speak, or these data has made it all the way to this policy for, a summary for policymakers. So this is the result of several, of many, and very complex media transformations also. And what I'm interested in here is the question of how the objectivity is achieved. And one of the things that struck me when I read the report was also the verbal language. And you're not supposed to read everything here in this little section, but please note here what I'm circling here, some of the terms: likely, it is very likely, extremely likely, medium confidence down here. So when I read the report, I thought, what do these terms really mean? How should I kind of consider them as being relative to some kind of probability, for instance? And it turns out actually that there exists a translation form in the IPCC panel documents that that teaches the writers how to use the different terms in relation to different likelihoods. So we see here, for instance, that very unlikely would be 0 to 10% probability. That is, that probability rate is translated into the words very unlikely if written in prose. And at the other end, then we have, for instance, when we read the words virtually certain, it has to do with a probability of 99 to 100% probability. So I find this extremely interesting and also, in a sense, impressive that this report targets objectivity to the extent that they have a kind of numbers to a kind of translation model for numbers into words, so that this should be impossible to misinterpret, impossible to not understand in the most correct way. So these are then, this was then the example of the objective truthfulness produced by truth claims by way of visualizations, by way of very exact language, and all the time this has to do with things we can analyze intermediately with intermediate tools, I would argue. My next example is a novel called Weather from 2020, written by American novelist Jenny Offill, who has made a novel which, in a sense, if we open it here, you would see that it's a regular novel, so to speak. It does not have pictures in it or illustrations or anything. It's a regular novel with only black letters on white pages, but nevertheless, following the idea of intermediate studies, I would say that this is definitely an intermediate novel nevertheless. And part of that is because, and here I've got a list, this is a novel that incorporates lots of other media types inside the fictional world. I'm here referring to a few books that I've been that I made some years ago concerning how to analyze, for instance, narrative literature or film from an intermediate perspective. You can check them out in the literature list also. So what is typical for this, for many novels actually, and very typical for this novel also, is that it incorporates lots of media types in it without really making it something, it doesn't want to make it something that we notice. But actually, if you list it, then you'll find that there's a podcast, an educational 3D game. We have supermarket flyers, magazines, bills, movies, telephone calls, letters. There's a person coding, which is also kind of translation, of course, from one medium to another. Signs and elevators, newsletters, lectures, etc., etc. So this novel is packed with media types, which all play a role in actually making a kind of a feeling, I think, for the protagonist in the novel, that things are hard to overview. It's hard to get a grasp of what is actually going on, because she is confronted with all these different media types all the time in her everyday life in upstate New York, as where she lives. So this is a novel that actually incorporates both lots of media and also lots of information concerning a threatening situation, partly related to climate crisis and partly related to a political crisis. And in one of these places where we have a kind of question answer cards or something like that, which is incorporated into the book, we hear this kind of scary Q&A, namely, what is the difference between a disaster and an emergency? An answer: a disaster is a sudden event that causes great damage or loss. An emergency is a situation in which normal operations cannot continue and immediate action is required so as to prevent a disaster. This is one of the signs I could come up with, hundreds of these signs, that something is going on here, and that the protagonist, the female protagonist, is trying to navigate in this and try to find out how to act. And actually, the further we get forward in this book, we find out that this couple actually turns into a kind of a prepper. Prepper, they want to isolate themselves, they want to save themselves. They buy a bit of land on the countryside, and then we stumbled upon a quote like this: Ben and I made a list of requirements for our doomstead. Arable land. Arable land means you can do agriculture, right? Arable land, a water source, access to a train line, high on a hill. Are we on a hill? Are we on a hill for flood or defense? She asks. Both, he answers. I'll build a moat, he said. Then went on the internet to learn how to do this, and it's towards the end of the book. So we learn here that they have grown so desperate that they want to move out from their comfortable city apartment, where they've started to feel threatened and feel they have no future. They go into the basics of, survivalism, you could say. And there's also, I think, a mild ironic tone in this, of course, because she's not really aware of what's going on. So she poses this very, very fundamental question: are we on a hill for flood or for defense? Flood would be then for the climate change catastrophe, or defense from the fascist government that they see coming up in the symbolized by Donald Trump, actually. Both, he says, which is also disconcertingly And then he is, orientated towards fixing things. So he says, I'll build a mold, he said, a mold, which is a kind of defense system. Then went onto the internet or how to do it, which also seems to say that he perhaps does not know very much about this. So he has to investigate from bottom up the very basic stuff of surviving. So in this book, I find this book very convincing in the way that it gradually shows how we can feel scared, feel a kind of a mild panic, and starting to change our ways by being confronted with disasters and emergencies. It seldomly quotes science directly, but nevertheless, there's science behind this, which is represented in a truthful way, in the sense that this is perhaps how it feels to live in a society that starts breaking down gradually, starting with my own little relationship. So this is a kind of fictive truthfulness used by, constructed by way of well-known narrative and fictive and aesthetic devices. That was my third example. And then finally to my fifth example, where we go into art instead. This is an installation visual art piece called Ice Watch from the Olafur Eliasson studio. Olafur Eliasson is a pretty well-known Danish Icelandic artist who has made lots of often installation artworks who kind of involves the environments and the urban landscapes and so on in pretty big installations. And this is then called the Ice Watch. It's been repeated in several towns around the world. And the idea is the same every time, that basically big ice blocks, human size and more, are cut out from the inland ice of Greenland, transported in ships to the actual exhibition site and put up there. And then they are gradually melting. And you can, as a participant, you can go there, you can touch the ice, you can smell the ice will melt, and you will walk around in wet surroundings. And often these ice sculptures or ice installations are put in front of, for instance, UN negotiations on climate change, as a kind of ticking clock counting down towards the inevitable melting of the ices, which symbolizes, of course, the larger melting of ices on Arctic and Antarctic also. This is interactive art that you can touch, you can walk around, and you can kiss it if you want, you can sit on it if you can get up there. And it's a mixing of something very, very specific and non-abstract in a sense. You can go there, see it, touch it, as I said, but also, of course, it's a kind of symbolically ordered. So at least in some of these installations, these ice blocks are ordered in a circle, which suggests a watch, of course. Watch the clock ticking down, perhaps, if we don't do anything about climate change and other environmental disasters. It has been said also that perhaps it resembles some of the gatherings of the elder persons in some pre-democratic communities, where the elder, for instance, would gather and resolve problems. So it's also a way of perhaps a kind of making a kind of a community, hinting at a community. And also, the title is, of course, nice in the way that it's both about something that resembles a watch, a clock, but also something that we can watch. We can watch ice as it melts, and perhaps be reminded of the larger situation we're in. It's an example of art that makes the questions of ecological crisis very sensible, very direct. Sometimes we may have problems understanding that the world, the temperatures degrees rise within 0.1, 0.2, etc. We have problems seeing directly how this affects us, how because it moves slowly, it moves abstractly, so to speak. But this artwork actually succeeds in, and it is based on scientific knowledge, on making in a very simple way. Actually, it makes us understand that climate change is here and we should do something about it. It makes the abstract science, it makes the abstract science sensible, perhaps we could say. It makes it understandable, and it almost forces us to try to change our mind a little bit. When we have seen this, we understand perhaps in another way than seeing it on television, reading about it in a novel, or seeing photographs of it. We understand that the ice is melting. So I find this to be a very good example of artwork that interferes with our ways of seeing the world. And it's once again, a truthful piece of art. There's no way of denying that the ice is melting. There's no way of denying that the ice here is also a kind of symbol of larger constellations outside this specific artwork. So to conclude, media studies investigates the mediated nature of the human world. That's what we do in media studies and in intermediate studies also. We studied the in-betweenness between man and world, you could say. That's where all the media are. Media are between human beings and between human beings and the world. The ecological emergency is a mediated phenomenon that deserves analysis. We only meet the crisis by way of mediations. That's a kind of paradox in itself, but that's how it is. And we need to understand and analyze and understand better this for two reasons here, at least two reasons. First, the general public, that's us in a sense, us outside the natural sciences, the general public outside science needs to understand the complicated but crucial scientific research. We need to understand this in new ways, and the examples I'm giving are different ways of creating truthfulness, being loyal to art, to being loyal to science, but in different ways. And also, we need to understand all the mediations because we must act upon the crisis, and science communication helps us to do that. So, in other words, I consider both a novel and the graphic novel and the science report as a kind, and also the artwork as a kind of science communication. It communicates science in different ways and in different truthful ways, but by way of very different affordances, as I would say. Affordances, which means possibilities and limitations. It's also important that we should not forget that artistic communication involves other effective and existential communicative modes that may be of very great help when knowledge is transformed into action. This is what it's all about, in a sense of knowledge creating agency. And here art can do something that normal science cannot do, I think. So as a kind of conclusion, my final sentence is that the climate emergency must be made sensible. Sensible here in a double sense of the word. We should kind of feel it with our senses, but also it should be something that we can understand, something that is not abstract anymore, something that makes sense, as we say. So I thank you for listening to this, and I hope that you may get interested in going on with your studies, perhaps getting inspired to follow some of the leads that I have laid out here. I'm gonna move down to this. and then to the reference list, and I will be leaving for a little moment here before I end this recording. Thank you very much.